especially with magic, I think people are immediately polarized. I think that every time I say, when I'm performing as a magician, if I tell someone I'm a magician, they have a response to it. And it's either a really good one or a really bad one. And I think that's because a lot of people don't have a lot of experiences with magic. And so they use those very few experiences to determine how they feel about it. So if they saw not too great magician when they were a kid, then they're kind of thinking magic is one very specific thing. Or if they had one interaction with a magician who was really good, then they're thinking it's like the most incredible thing that they've ever seen.
I have been a fan of magic for a very, very long time. I had an uncle who was both a professional set designer and an amateur magician, and he taught me my very first magic trick when I was a little kid, which is in the play. There's literally lines of dialogue about one character says their uncle taught them a magic trick, and it is the magic trick my uncle taught me, which is pouring a gallon of milk into a folded up newspaper. So that was some piece of it, was his personal connection.
I sort of discovered magic along the same time I started becoming a performer. I was about 9 or 10, and I got a magic kit for Christmas, and I lucked out. I got a really good magic kit. It was called Mark Wilson's Complete Course in Magic, and it was a big book, and it comes with some props. But it really goes into everything. It starts with the most basic tricks, but it has plans for big, grand scale illusions too. So it can keep you busy for a long time. So over the years, as I was growing up, I was able to learn more and more as I was able to absorb more difficult material.
An extraordinary, sort of exquisite effect in magic is so powerful that it eclipses literally everything else. It's one of the things I've learned in working on this play is you don't try to fight in effect in magic. You try to in some way harness the power and the beauty of it and let it serve the narrative, but you don't try to let the narrative compete with the magic effect that is going on, because the effect will always win.
There's a lot of stereotypes about magic out there, but I also think a lot of stereotypes are true. I think there's a lot of stereotypical magicians that do very, very generic stuff that, and I've been guilty of this before too, so I'm not excluding myself from it necessarily, but hopefully trying to push myself past that into new territory.
I've been to magic shows where people are gasping out loud, screaming profanities inadvertently, viscerally just screaming profanities, or where they've just burst into tears. And I can't help but ask, why doesn't the theater feel like that more often?
So I don't approach being a magician and being an actor differently, and I know they're received differently, and I know you perform in different venues and contexts, and I know all that's true, and I still believe that. But in terms of when I'm performing, I'm trying to be as present in both, because I think that's just what good performance is and what good theater is.
On a larger level, I just like what magic can do as a form of theater. I think for me, the essence of theater is its impermanence, right? The idea that we are in this space together for a limited amount of time, and then it's gone, it's over, it's done. I think magic in some way captures the essence of that so beautifully. It is really about the profound beauty and the theatricality of a moment.
So I keep going back to this quote. Robert Houdin, who's a 19th century magician, he says, a magician is just an actor playing the role of a magician. And I think that's true across the board, whether or not you're doing the magic play or if I'm performing as a magician in my own capacity.
I got into the world of magic. I think one of the things that struck me was this sort of intrinsic metaphor of somebody who could never be present for all these miraculous experiences they were providing for somebody else. An example, without naming the magician, I went to a really great magic show, and the performer told this sort of fantastic story. I then met the guy who did the show afterwards for a drink at the bar. He was kind enough to sit down. There's been so many magicians who have been so kind to chat and really enhance the play. But he knew I was at his show, and he knew I had heard, well, in theory at least, knew I had heard that story, right? Because he knew I had been in his audience. And we got to talking, and not long after that, he said, I'll tell you great story, and then word for word delivered the same monologue that he had delivered in the show, with even the same cadence, right? And that was just one of many striking examples where sometimes the magicians were aware of it, sometimes like this they were not, but how not present they sometimes had to be, and whether it's on a smaller scale of being a few steps ahead of their audience member, or on larger scales, like in that example, it seemed to intrinsically hold a metaphor that I was really interested in exploring, in this play and in my own life.
Presence and trying to be available is always an ongoing struggle. And in magic, there's maybe more technicalities you have to worry about than a typical acting role. And those are obstacles to being present and in the moment. But the goal is always to find a place where you can let those go and just connect with the person in front of you. And usually as an actor, it's a scene partner. And as a magician, it's usually a volunteer who didn't know that they were going to become your scene partner, but they are now.
We never really considered having like actors as audience members or plans from the beginning. We just wanted to have legitimate audience members, and then the question on top of that becomes, well, how do you convince the rest of the audience that these are legitimate audience members? And so that's its own question of how much do you want to trust the audience, how much do you want to try to prove that, and how much do you want to try to establish that and then give them the agency to decide, to trust that, to believe that.
When I look for volunteers, I think I'm trying to find someone who is connecting to the story and has an open presence and genuinely also wants to be there and wants to be up on stage with me. Aside from that, then we just let the dice roll, and we've been pretty lucky. We've had really good audience members come and be part of the story.
We always felt from the beginning, and playing it to our director, that we want the play to be, emotional and dangerous and different, but we always want to take great care of the audience members. And it's one of the things that Brett is so good at, is that people are always going to be respected on stage and they're going to be taken care of. And Brett's great at identifying people who are game to play, but we also wanted to feel like we are going to reward people for coming on stage rather than punish them.
When we were in the early drafts of this show, the early stages of the show rather, I would pick what he wrote down. He would write down stage directions, and then I would come up with ways to do it. And then that's how him writing the part for me sort of was born out of this collaborative process where, because I was sort of the voice in the hands of this character from the get-go, we had this rapport that became a shorthand, and that's how the character was born.
I sort of said I feel like there should be a piece of magic on every single page of the script, and that's not just a trick, but what is the moment that feels like magic in the same way that it feels like magic when Brett's hand is completely empty and then all of a sudden something just appears.
With this play, you can't really work on it. The way Andrew's written this play, you can't experience it without experiencing the magic simultaneously. It doesn't really add up. It doesn't really make sense.
I've always wanted this to be a piece of theater about a magician, and not a magic show. The contents of this piece of theater about a magician is that we begin in a magic show, and then we go a lot of places.
Because before there was even dialogue written, before the play, while Andrew was still exploring the topics of magic and trust and the storytelling that he wanted to explore in terms of the characters and the archetypes, we were just having conversations about magic in general. We were just talking, Andrew and I were just talking about what's good magic, what's bad magic, moments that we will never forget, moments that we think were some of the best, experiences we've had in the theater. And for both of us,
what we aspire to, whether it's successful or not, is to create something miraculous on every page, in every minute of the show.
I just hope that people are open-minded once they sit down and watch, and that they can redefine what magic means to them based on our performance. That's the hope anyway.